Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man of controversy and debate for over the past 100 years. If you take a simple look across the internet, it won't take long for you to find people who both adore and hate the man. And it can be hard to properly discern fact from fiction when trying to do even the simplest of research. So, was Kaiser Wilhelm a bad person? Of course, if we take a look at him through our modern lens of morality, he can't be much else than a rather flawed individual with some serious moral problems. But what about through the lens of morality from the early 20th century? Well, first, we need to know just who he was and what he did. I'm the Wolf of 1918, and today we're going to take a look at the last Kaiser of Germany. Born on January 27, 1859, Friedrich Wilhelm Victor Albert suffered from Erb's palsy in his left arm due to a traumatic breech birth. This paralyzed and shriveled limb would later be a suspected reason for many of Wilhelm's shortcomings and flaws when it came to his foreign policy and actions as Kaiser. Some usually overlooked aspects that contributed heavily to his actions and personality in his later life were the experiences he had with his parents and Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. It's interesting to note that one of the main reasons Wilhelm had such a problem with his arm was mostly due to his mother, constantly fretting about it and treating it as a severe disability that needed to be hidden and overcome for Wilhelm to be successful as a monarch. This eventually led to her forcing Wilhelm to learn how to ride a horse. Although difficult, eventually the 8-year-old Wilhelm was able to maintain balance throughout the failed attempts and endless tears. He would go on to blame his mother for the torments inflicted upon me in his memoirs. His relationship with his father, Friedrich III, was far more stable, however, and during his childhood he was extremely close to him, which was unusual for a time period in which being close to your father was seen as feminine and not masculine enough for an heir to an empire. Unfortunately, due to his upbringing and tutoring by more traditional members of the German aristocracy, he began to look upon his father with suspicion and doubt. Wilhelm saw his father's more liberal beliefs as part of his mother's influence over him, and as such began to grow further apart from him as he became older. This divide was furthered by Otto von Bismarck, who saw Wilhelm as someone who could be molded to be more agreeable to his beliefs instead of Friedrich's constant argumentativeness and pushing back on Bismarck's more conservative and anti-democratic policies. As a young Wilhelm entered adulthood, he would go through the traditional military phase as an heir to the throne, and he was assigned as a Leutnant in the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards at Potsdam. Here's where Wilhelm would feel accepted for the first time in his life. In fact, he would later write in his memoirs that he considered the people he knew while in the military his true family. This would go on to heavily influence his actions and policies later on, and is one of the many reasons why he was rarely seen not wearing a military uniform while Kaiser. He would be coronated shortly after his father's death, on June 15, 1888. From the outset, Wilhelm would set things in motion that would come to define his reign as a monarch. He was quick to disagree with the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and adopted an almost polar opposite foreign policy. Impatient, and believing it necessary to thrust Germany into being one of the top nations of the world, Wilhelm continually pushed for an aggressive and militant expansion that created anti-German sentiment in various nations across the globe. This ran counter to Bismarck's rather peaceful, slow expansion policy, built on the principle of national security rather than expansionism. The breaking point came in the form of social beliefs. Bismarck was extremely anti-socialist, and was adamant not to give an inch to workers' demands. The Kaiser, on the other hand, had some level of sympathy for them and wanted to look for a solution and compromise. Unlike his British liberal, more democratic-leaning parents, Wilhelm believed it was solely the monarch that could help the lower classes, and wanted to do what he could to assist them. This divide eventually led to the Kaiser forcing Bismarck into retirement. While Wilhelm had forced Bismarck out due to his insistence to do things himself without interference from the Iron Chancellor, Wilhelm would end up leaving most of the domestic issues to his appointed chancellors. It could be argued that Wilhelm didn't like Bismarck's domestic policies, and he wanted someone who would help the lower classes, but there's no real evidence to support such a claim. In the end, this was the opposite of what should have happened, as Wilhelm was very competent at dealing with the domestic issues of the nation, and showed himself competent enough through his effective promotion of the arts and sciences throughout Germany, and his support of the various social movements in the nation. Unfortunately, his obsession with the military led to a situation that was less than ideal. Wilhelm wanted to prove himself to his people, aides, and, most of all, his family in Britain. He saw his crippled arm as the fault of the English doctors, and had come to the conclusion his English family looked down upon him because of his deformity. Due to this, he became obsessed with making Germany greater than Britain, and pushed forward one of the primary reasons for Britain taking an anti-German stance in the early 20th century. The Kaiser built a navy. The construction and quick expansion of the Imperial German Navy is one of the biggest mistakes Kaiser Wilhelm made, in my opinion. And that is mainly due to the two things it caused. The first was that it negatively affected the British opinion of Germany, especially the Kaiser. They saw the move of building a navy as a direct challenge to Britain, and it started the naval arms race between the two nations that would eventually lead to Britain being more willing to go to war against Germany in 1914. The other issue was the effect the project had on the German economy, specifically how much money was dumped into a project that would only cripple Germany. For reference as to how expensive this project was, the amount of materials and money that was sunk into the naval program could have been used to create another 2 to 4 army corps, which would have been far more useful for Germany during the First World War. The other problem it created economically was that it hastened the speed at which grain production was already dropping. Germany had been experiencing lower grain yields and increased grain imports due to a decrease in the over-agricultural sector of the German economy. Most Germans worked in some form of the more industrial sector, whether that was mining, factory work, or construction. While initially nothing critical, it became a problematic area when the naval expansion began, and was compounded when the naval arms race with Britain kicked off. This naval expansion was a great example of just how erroneous Wilhelm's foreign policy was, and how it generally backfired on him during most of his time as Kaiser. The Kaiser also had another major flaw. He was a vehement racist and white supremacist. So much so that the Yellow Peril of the early 20th century is mostly credited to Wilhelm as its de facto creator. He hated the Chinese, and despised the Japanese, viewing both as inferior and a threat to Western civilization if they were to combine forces. One of his most infamous moments came with his farewell address as the German troops were disembarking to fight the Boxer Rebellion.
"Should you encounter the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited. Just as 1,000 years ago the Huns under their King Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend. May the name German be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever again dare to look cross-eyed at a German."
This would later be known as the Hun speech, and is where the moniker for the Germans came from. Another event showcasing his racism were the events in German West Africa. After a revolt by the indigenous peoples there, who rose up against the harsh rule of the local colonial government, the Kaiser appointed a rather underqualified candidate to deal with the situation, Lothar von Trotha. The only reason he really chose Trotha was due to his previous record in China, in which he ruthlessly dealt with the Boxers. What would ensue was a genocide of the local people, as Trotha would trap entire groups and force them into areas where the only water was poisoned by the German colonials. Around 34,000 to 100,000 Hararos and Namaquas were killed, and it only ceased when the Kaiser finally recalled Trotha to Germany after several colonial officers opposed the systematic killings, saying the indigenous people were more useful as labor rather than just killing them. It's unknown if Wilhelm was aware of the genocide before it was brought up to him, as many of the documents relating to the German colonies were lost after the Reichsarchives building was destroyed by fire in 1945. However, based on the Kaiser's treatment of Trotha upon his return to Germany, it can at least be said that Wilhelm didn't care that the genocide happened. Although Wilhelm would go on to hate the Nazis and saw them as dangerous to the German people, he was also anti-Semitic, to an extent, blaming Jewish greed for the collapse of the German war effort. He never fully accepted that it was his actions before the war that had created the British opposition to Germany, and blamed the British banks and Jews for the eventual collapse of the Reich. Wilhelm wasn't all bad, however. As I mentioned previously, he cared about social issues and the struggle of the common citizen. In one event after the Norwegian town Eolsund burnt down in 1904, the Kaiser personally sent 4 ships loaded with supplies that greatly helped with the reconstruction of the town. Even after the war, this level of care never went away, and he was commonly seen in the forests around his estate in the Netherlands, cutting down trees and chopping firewood for the local poor who couldn't afford to buy their own, and did not have the rights or the time to cut it themselves either. He did all this with just one working arm, and was loved by the locals for it. Friedrich Wilhelm wasn't a great person, but he wasn't evil either. For all of his flaws, he was one of the few monarchs of the era that could have brought around effective social and economic reform. Unfortunately, he was raised to believe the ideals of democracy were evil plots to destroy the German Empire. His obsession with the German military and foreign affairs also meant his talent for fixing domestic social issues went unused for the most part, thus putting him in a position where many people saw him as an aggressive, impatient, and argumentative monarch, which eventually led to his fall from grace and abdication in 1918. In the end, it can be difficult at some level to properly judge him. His racism and white supremacy, coupled with his horrible management of the German military and foreign affairs, really showcase his overall incompetence and faults as a monarch. And although he cared for the struggles of the lower classes, he rarely did anything to fix the issues that boiled over into revolution in 1918. Through the modern lens of morality, Wilhelm wasn't a good person, and his complacency with genocide is a rather egregious crime, even for the ideals of people back in the early 20th century. Even when accounting for the good things about his character, he was a severely flawed human being, and is not someone we should hold in high regard. Special thank you to my awesome Patreon backers for supporting my channel. They're a huge reason why I've continued making content, and I don't think I can express my thanks enough. If you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing to my channel, and please be sure to share your thoughts or feedback with me in the comments below. I know this will be sort of a controversial episode, as there's a lot of people who really like the Kaiser, and I figured I'd shed some light on some of his flaws and the problems he had as a human being and the struggles in his life. So I hope that this was educational, and if you disagree, please let me know your thoughts down below. I'd love to hear them. You can keep up with me through my Discord or Instagram, and if you want to support what I'm doing, you can check out my Teesprings shop and my Patreon, linked in the description below.